You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome back to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
That makes me Bill Thomas.
We're joined for a second episode by Kate Miles, author of Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenadoah Murders, which is getting quite a lot of interest considering that there was just a big announcement made in this case. Kate, thank you for joining us again.
Hi, still simmering with righteous indignation over here.
As you should be.
I'm always looking for some good news when we talk about these cases, and obviously getting some degree of information and a potential offender named and some answers, at least some, I would say is good news. One other piece of good news I think that's in the mix here. I struggle with the pronunciation of the Attorney General's name, but I'll do my best. And
Do it.
Kristin will help me if I stumble. Virginia Attorney General Jason Miyares. I got to think back to my life in Los Angeles and get a little bit more Latino going on there. Has made funds available for sexual assault kit initiative grants. These are being given around the country, but in Virginia in particular, the backlog at the state lab in Virginia and at Quantico, the FBI lab, also located in Virginia, is horrendous, particularly at Quantico, because they handle the FBI's cases and they handle cases for other law enforcement agencies. There are 17,000 different law enforcement agencies across the country, and the smaller ones definitely don't have their own labs. So the FBI's backlog is incredible, and I don't mean that in a good way. We've been waiting in some cases with the Colonial Parkway Murders evidence for a year or more just for, let's say, 3 pieces of evidence to be tested. If the results are not what they want them to be, they might send in more evidence, but then we're literally waiting another year for test results. The good news is there are private labs around the country, many of whom we've talked to here on Mind Over Murder. And with these sexual assault kit initiative grants, they are able to test untested rape kits, evidence from unsolved homicides, help identify unidentified remains, etc. One of the things that came out was the recent news in the Colonial Parkway Murders is directly as a result of a SACI grant. And this result is also partially as a result of another one of these SACI grants. I want to make sure that we're thanking the Attorney General and the people that run the SAKI initiative around the country. It's really important, and this is a bright spot because this allows us to use taxpayer funds to take the evidence to the private labs who have the state-of-the-art equipment and can turn around things in a matter of weeks or months instead of literally years. I noticed that after the FBI press release came out, I noticed that the Virginia State Police, who were also essential to helping solve this case, they issued their own press release, and then the Attorney General sent out his own press release. And they all deserve credit for helping to move this case forward. I know there's lots of places where we're frustrated, but that's actually a bright spot, and I think it's good news for families who are waiting answers in cases across the country.
Yes, absolutely. And we know that there is a tremendous underfunding of this kind of work, which needs to be resolved. It should not be the case that the FBI lab takes a year or more to be able to process. It should not be the case that they have such a backlog that they're not able to do their work, which is good work, we should say. The 3 of us were talking off air earlier. We were trying to pin down the number of untested rape kits in the U.S. We can't even pin that down. We were finding statistics as variable as 25,000 to 100,000. It may even be more. Those are all people and their families and their loved ones who deserve justice, who haven't had justice because, again, the kits haven't even been initially tested, let alone retested. that's an epidemic in this country, and it's something that needs to get resolved immediately.
Absolutely, could not agree more. Last episode, Kate, we were talking a little bit about what we know so far and also what we don't know about Walter Leo Jackson Sr., aka Leo. One of the things that you had mentioned that I thought was particularly interesting was the fact that the FBI said, this guy's an avid hiker. I don't really know how they know that. I would be very interested to know how they know. I'm curious if you could take a couple of minutes before we get into some more information about Walter Leo Jackson. Can you explain a little bit about the kind of hiking culture around the AT and the sort of people, not only that were hiking the trail, amazing people like the ants that were hiking the trail, but also one thing that you mentioned in your book was the number of alarming people who were also hiking the AT around the time that Lollie and Julie were on their trip to Shenandoah. Can you get into that a little? Because that was probably one of the most alarming parts of your book for me, is the sort of characters who also end up on the trail who may not be as upstanding as the rest of us.
Sure. And this was one of the culture clashes that really made a lot of this investigative work difficult. The first and primary culture clash was whenever a violent crime happens in the national park, that crime investigation becomes the joint purview of the FBI and the National Park Service law enforcement rangers. And as I say in the book, those are two very different cultures. And we saw a lot of the infighting that happened just between those two cultures, just when it came to how are we going to bag and catalog and process the evidence from this particular crime scene. So we saw that. There's another major culture clash that's happening, and that's between both the FBI and the National Park Service police and the hikers on the Appalachian Trail. We should say, and I really always need to do this strongly, especially for my friends at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, which is the nonprofit arm of the trail that stewards and manages it. Lollie and Julie were not on the AT. They were just off of the AT. I think that gets misrepresented a lot of the time. They had spent significant amount of time on the trail. At that time in particular, and still today, there were certain cultural things that happened on the trail. For instance, folks there rarely go by their given names. They almost always have trail names. Those trail names change over time, and they're given to you by someone else. As I say in the book, at the beginning of a hike, you may be a little hapless on the trail, and maybe you leave your stuff all over the place. You may be given the trail name Yard Sale, and then that may evolve into something else, so Yard Arm or whatever. And so just tracking down these people who may have had multiple trail names was really tricky. And the folks doing this investigation didn't come from that culture. One of the really interesting things to me is that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy sent some of their own people down, both because they weren't getting information about this crime, and so they didn't know how to keep their people safe. And also because they realized really quickly that both of these law enforcement agencies were way out of their element when it came to parsing this out. So they went to advocate for the trail and the people on the trail. The other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind here is, again, 1996, long before cell phones, long before any smart technology, what hikers on the trail have always done is use trail logs to keep each other safe. We saw this in the very tragic murder of Ron Sanchez just a few years ago. The individual in that case responsible for that murder had already been known to people on their hikes. And so they were leaving notes to each other in these trail logs saying, watch out for this guy, he's no good, or whatever else too. So that's how they're communicating with each other. And that's the lifeline of hikers, especially pre-cell phones. One of the first things that happened after this murder was that the National Park Service investigators and the FBI came in and took all of those trail logs. So the through hikers didn't have a way to communicate with each other, and they were understandably terrified. So there's a lot to that. You mentioned the number of people who were reasonable suspects because of their unsavory past. That was a little bit more Shenandoah National Park than it was the trail, so far as we know. But there were cameras at the entrances to the park that were recording license plates that then investigators were then running against registrations to figure out who was in the park at the time. And as an avid trail user and an avid national park visitor, I was highly disturbed by the number of sex offenders, people who are evading bail, people for whom there were warrants for their arrest, who were in Shenandoah just that weekend of the crimes as well, too. And so that created a very big pool of potential suspects that I think was really hard to work through. The other thing that for me became very clear very quickly is the lack of accounting system for crime in the national parks. And this continues to be true today.
Yes.
Each park is at the purview of the superintendent if, how, and when crime gets recorded and investigated. So we still, to this day, despite internal Inspector General reviews by the Department of the Interior, despite Government Accountability Office reviews, we have no codified reporting system for crime in our national parks. And we cannot say with any certainty at what rate it happens, how many murders happen in a year, how many rapes, how many violent crimes, how much malfeasance occurs at the hands of rangers. This, again, is information that the American public needs to know.
We've been dealing with the National Park Service in the Colonial Parkway murders for 37 years. There's no question that the National Park Service doesn't want you to be thinking about crime when you're enjoying your time in the national park. Even what we talked about in our last episode, I have still never been able to get over the fact that Julie Williams and Lollie Winans were brutally murdered. It wasn't a bear attack. It wasn't a murder-suicide. It was none of those things. It was clearly a double homicide. And yet they never informed the thousands of people that passed through there that there had been a double homicide of these two women hiking and camping at the Shenandoah National Park. I've never been able to get over the fact that the National Park Service got away with not even telling their visitors that an extremely violent crime had taken place, and they had no way of knowing whether those other visitors would still be at some risk. They didn't even know if the offender had left the national park. It still shocks me to this day.
There was an internal memo that I quote in the book in which there was a very deliberate decision made to withhold this information and, if asked, to deny it. And it was really because of the intrepid reporting of local reporters, including the Washington Blade, an LGBTQ plus publication in Washington, D.C. And it was really the work of these local reporters who kept at it and kept saying, how could this have been a bear attack? How could this have been a murder-suicide? What are you telling us? And why are you not telling us? It was because of that bootstrap reporting that the truth came out. And I owe so much of my work to them and what they were doing day in and day out, again and again, from 1996 onward.
One of the things that I love the most about your book is that there is so much peeling back the layers of what has previously been hidden for so long. And it's just one bombshell after another for the first 200 pages. I'm sitting there and I've been highlighting and annotating this even more than I did the first time around when I read it. And I've got whole entire pages where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I can't believe this actually happened. There is so much. You'd used the term malfeasance in our last episode, and I think that is true on so many levels, not just with the FBI, but with the NPS as well. This is really just appalling. And revisiting the book now for this reporting, I'm still appalled by it. What, if anything, can our listeners do to tell NPS and FBI, hey, we want some more accountability here? Is there anything that we can do as national park users and hikers and things like that? Or do we just have to let this be what it is?
I'm really glad you asked that question. And I think there's so much that we can do. I think a lot of us feel disempowered right now. And I think more than a few people feel pretty cynical about politics in America right now for some pretty good reasons. But yeah, no, we need to be doing a lot more. And I, as somebody who really loves to be outside in the wilderness, I really take to heart what Roosevelt first said and that Ken Burns echoed, that the national park system, if it was not America's best idea, it was a really great idea that America had, which is, let's make sure that the wilderness is accessible to everyone here. That was a great idea. That has not happened. The wilderness is not accessible to differently abled people. It is not accessible to people who identify in what we call socially subordinate groups. So people who identify as queer or non-binary or BIPOC or differently abled or whatever else. And we have not shorn that up. We have not made the wilderness accessible to folks. So one of the things we can do is insist upon that. And then the other thing we can do is we can insist upon better funding for the National Park Service so that there are qualified rangers and they have the equipment they need to do the work. We saw a real spike in visitors to the park during COVID, and that has not abated. So we have even more visitors than ever, and yet the Park Service continues to atrophy in terms of its funding that's available to it. And the other thing, one of the most shocking things to me during writing the book was beginning to realize that while there are many very service-oriented, diligent, talented individuals doing law enforcement work in the parks, it is also true that there are people who are not that doing law enforcement in the parks. The great work of Paul Berkowitz, who has written several books on the subject and who was a whistleblower as a law enforcement ranger for the park. He identified this very real problem that occurs in these parks, which is very similar to what we saw with the Catholic priest abuse scandal that was happening in New England. And that is rangers and their bad behavior are ultimately rewarded by these lateral transfers and promotions. One of the rangers who played a prominent role, not only in Kathy and Becky's investigation, but also Lollie and Julie's, later went on to take evidence without a warrant, to put it in an evidence locker when his supervisor insisted that he return it because it was illegally captured. He responded by changing the lock on the evidence locker. And for that, he received a lateral move. That kind of stuff is just not okay. Policing that and holding the Park Service accountable for that, that's really important as well, too. Everybody deserves to feel safe on any National Park Service land, regardless of any identification or orientation they have. And as a country, we've really sat down on that in ways that are not defendable.
One of the questions that has been asked, not only for Kate, but also to us, and I think this is a good time to address it, is whether or not there is any possibility that Leo Jackson might be involved in the Colonial Parkway murders, because there are substantial similarities between Julie and Lollie's murder and Kathy and Becky's murder 10 years previous. And Bill, I'll let you go into that here in 1 second. So the question that I think a lot of people rightfully have is, could Leo Jackson have been responsible for Kathy and Becky and then graduated, if you will, onto the travesty that he enacted upon Julie and Lollie? We did find out some information about Leo Jackson, and I'll let you guys get into that. So whoever wants to start can start on that.
Some of the dates of his incarceration, I'm talking about Jackson now, would preclude his personal involvement in the first 3 of what we call the Colonial Parkway murders. So he's incarcerated in Ohio for one of the many rapes that he was involved in. He's in jail in 86, 87, and 88. Thomas Dowski, Edward Nobling, and of course now we have an identified suspect in Robin Edwards, David Nobling, and the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley in 86, 87, and 88 are precluded because he was incarcerated during that time. He was out of jail in time for the last of the Colonial Parkway murders, which is happening over Labor Day weekend 1989, and that's the murder of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer. Not ruling it out, but the investigators that are currently working the case have some pretty strong suspects in that last one of the Colonial Parkway murders as well. I don't think that Jackson is involved in the Colonial Parkway murders per se. I'll let Kate weigh in as well.
I think that it would be difficult, but not impossible, to make a case that he was somehow able to leave this incarceration during the period of Kathy and Becky's murder to commit this. I think we've all gone back and forth probably in terms of the degree to which, first of all, of the crimes under the category Colonial Parkway murders are in fact connected or perhaps by the same perpetrator. I think that's obviously been a big question for people. I think we've maybe all gone back and forth a little bit on the degree to which Kathy and Becky's crime is connected to Lollie and Julie's crime. Certainly it's true that there are some astounding and disturbing similarities between the two crimes, which make it, I think, very tempting, if not easy, to assume that the same person was involved. But we've never been able to parse that out or unpack that. And so I think that's probably going to be a question mark until we have some more answers, particularly where Kathy and Becky are concerned.
And the FBI did say in 1996 publicly that they were exploring the possibility that the Thomas Dowski murder, not necessarily the other Colonial Parkway murders, that individual double homicide could be related to the murder of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans. So they all got the parallels. And I know we don't want to get too graphic here on Mind Over Murder, but there are a lot of substantial similarities when you've got healthy, athletic, outdoorsy lesbian couples killed in a national park on a 3-day weekend. Knives are used. There are definitely similarities. As Kate says, sometimes an investigator might think, wow, we got to check that out. If, for example, all these years later now, we've identified a suspect in the Shenandoah case, I think that moves the Colonial Parkway murders, and specifically Kathy and Becky's murder, onto the much less likely list. It's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for Jackson to be incarcerated in Ohio and killing couples in Virginia. Some of the other Virginia cases, however, there are gaps in his time in prison. So he's in and out, that's probably a whole discussion for another day. Why is this serial rapist and kidnapper
serving very short sentences?
Yes, remarkably, disturbingly short sentences for extreme sexual violence. And when you look at his dates in and out of prison, you're like, why is he only serving a couple of years for what sound like absolutely heinous crimes? But in some examples that are worth talking about, he is out of jail during key periods where there are other unsolved murders in Virginia.
And the wrinkle for me, again, that we don't know is, was Jackson acting alone in the case of Lollie and Julie? And if Jackson was not acting alone, if, for instance, Jackson was potentially being groomed by a killer, is it possible? And again, the likelihood of this, I'm going to say, is small. But is it possible that if he was not acting alone, was that other individual somehow involved with Kathy and Becky? Again, probably unlikely at this point, I think we can say. But until we know the answer, I don't think we should rule anything out.
Last time you talked with us about the Anns and the two men that they met. There's the one guy, they were interested in him as a character because he was a thru hiker. And it sounds like thru hikers are considered cool on some level when day hikers or weekend hikers meet people that are actually doing the full length of the Appalachian Trail. We suspect that the second man, the one in the car, could have been Jackson and certainly physically resembles their recollection nearly 30 years later, of course. Do we know who the first man is, the so-called thru hiker?
We do not. We know who he is not. We know he is not Mark Ivanitz. We know he is not Daryl Rice, but we do not know who he is. One of the things I'm trying to do right now, in addition to trying to unpack other potential crimes that Jackson may have been involved in, is trying to track down who this individual is or was, why this person knew things that no one else knew. That's always been a big question. That's always been something that readers have keyed in on. Yeah. And I think until we have those answers, it is fair to think that it is a possibility that these two individuals were somehow involved together. We don't know to what degree, but it certainly seems like there was a distinct connection. They have information they should not have had, and it certainly is something that bears additional research for sure.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Before we get back to the podcast, just wanted to remind you that we have a GoFundMe effort going on right now. This campaign is designed to help us raise funds to help promote Mind Over Murder and specifically to push the Colonial Parkway Murders investigation forward. We'd love it if you could support us in any way that you can. Any donation from $5 to whatever you can afford is very much appreciated and will be incredibly helpful. The link is in the show notes and in our social media pages. As always, thanks for your support. Now back to Mind Over Murder.
One of the things that I was particularly interested in was the report from the behavioral science unit that you quoted from. regarding this report so that our listeners can hear it too, and then have you assess, okay, given what the BSU said back then, and given what we know about Leo Jackson now, how well did these things gel? I think we're doing what you said last time. We're letting the FBI check their work, only we're going to check it for them.
They're really going to like this, I can tell you.
Oh, I'm sure they are.
You know they're wearing T-shirts that say, "We heart Bill, Kristin, and Kate," right?
We've been telling people for a while that we're off the FBI's Christmas card list, and this is just going to cement that.
Look, if they won't check their work, as Kristin says, I guess we're going to have to check it for them.
This is talking about the fact that the NPS in Richmond FBI field office had exhausted every lead and ruled out every suspect. They had worked with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, BAU today, to construct a profile of the killer. The subsequent report concluded that the murder of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans was a sexually motivated crime perpetrated by one offender acting alone. The offender, the report's authors surmised, had previously demonstrated behavior consistent with sexual offenders. Most likely, the assailant saw the attack on Lollie and Julie as an opportunity to act out a personal fantasy that linked physical aggression with sexuality. The report also stated that based on the crime scene and evidence collected so far, the offender had pre-selected Julie and Lollie as his victims. He had conducted scrupulous planning to ensure that the crime unfolded based on his fantasy and with minimal risk of being discovered. Probably, the report concluded he'd been traveling with a murder kit for some time, most likely in his vehicle. He was probably a prolific consumer of violent pornography. He liked to keep tokens from his crimes, personal items like underwear, jewelry, or wallets, to enhance his fantasies after the crime. He also probably retained records of the crime, including his written plans, photographs or drawings, and newspaper clippings, which he would keep hidden and stored in a way that provided both security and ready access. I know we're not going to get all of the answers to all of that, but did the BSU back then do a pretty decent job of profiling Leo Jackson?
Yes, but I think one of the questions that has always been, I think, a very important one is, how did the perpetrator find Lollie and Julie? They were camping on a disused trail that used to be the bridal trail, and that's bridal as in horses, not wedding attire. And so they were camping on this disused trail that was very hard to find. Their tent was not visible when you were descending the trail. The National Park Service rangers responsible for patrolling this area walked past Lollie and Julie's campsite multiple times when they were searching for the women and did not see the tent. Big question is, how did this person find Lollie and Julie? One potential answer is that either one or both of them had walked up the third of a mile to the Skyland Lodge and Resort, where they might have gotten a drink or used the bathroom or the phone or something like that, and the person had either followed one or both of them back to the campsite. That's one potential scenario. Even if, and something I've thought about in the case of Jackson is, so far as we know, Jackson had only ever perpetrated rape and kidnap using one woman at a time, right? Mm-hmm. It's a lot to take on two. One potential scenario is Jackson followed, for instance, Julie back from the lodge. Julie perhaps went up by herself, which we know they were not always together. So maybe Julie went up to use the phone or get a cup of tea or something like that. He saw her and thought she was acting alone or by herself, and that he followed her thinking he was following a single woman. That's possible. But still, he would have then very quickly realized that she was camping with another woman and a dog. So whoever it was saw the scene and still decided it was a good risk for them.
Or he might have been committed to it. In other words, if he had followed her back and then he had decided he was going to attack this woman, for whatever reason, continues to plunge forward, even with two women and a dog. From everything I've ever read about Taj, she sounds like the sweetest dog around.
Yeah.
So I don't know that he would necessarily attack someone, even if they were attacking his favorite person. We talked about escalation last time. This could be part of that. And then maybe he's committed to it. He has attacked her, and then the second woman shows up. There's a lot of different scenarios here that he's clearly prepared himself to commit this act, because you mentioned a murder kit in our last episode, and I have no doubt that he came equipped to rape and kill. The BAU mentions it as well in their profile, that they thought he would have brought a murder kit with him in his vehicle. And I think they may be right about a fair amount of this. As a matter of fact, when Kristin was reading them, I was taking them off. And probably for the first 8 or so of the data points that they had mentioned, I actually was thinking, yep. Mm-hmm. As we got a little further into the list, I thought, I'm not sure I could answer that question necessarily, but I couldn't rule it out. So you could see a couple of scenarios.
Sure. One of the things that's always been very strange about this particular incident, in addition to the fact that the women were pretty fundamentally unfindable unless you had followed them back from Skyland Lodge, was the staging of the vibrator. Mm. And this was a rabbit hole that I went down at great length with some really smart and fabulous feminist scholars who are vibrator experts, and holy cow, are they amazing. So this was a vibrator that everybody who knew Lollie and Julie said didn't belong to either one of them. We don't know that conclusively. We do know that, as one expert told me, there were infinitely better models out there by the time, and this was a pretty rudimentary truck stop version. So there was the staging of the vibrator. So we always assumed that by the sheer fact that this vibrator, whether it belonged to Lollie and Julie or to the perpetrator, that it was so prominently staged at the murder scene, that alone said that there was a significant sexual component to this, for sure. Telling that investigators always had that I think I agree with, and certainly see no reason to disagree with, was that Julie was probably the primary target, that Lollie was probably killed first. And again, not to be too graphic, but her body was found in her sleeping bag in the tent. Julie was then taken about 20 yards away along with her sleeping pad. When UV light analysis was completed on the sleeping pad, there's a very strange image of what appears to be Julie's calves and what looks like a BDSM leather bondage device that's never been explained, and certainly was not among the things that were found at the scene. So all of that led investigators, and I think rightly, to assume that Julie was more of a primary target and that there was definitely a sexual component to that. I don't know a lot of the details of how Jackson committed his crimes. I don't know a lot about those things. I don't know to what degree all of this tracks with him. Certainly it tracks with a serial rapist in general. But I think until we know more about the specifics of how Jackson committed his crimes, we won't know to what degree this might have been a progression or regression or anything else.
I would love for us to have an opportunity, and it would be great to pursue this, the details of Jackson's other crimes and how he proceeded. We know he was a house painter, which presents a lot of opportunity to observe people's homes, both inside and outside. It would be great if we are able to get some of the records of some of these earlier cases back in Ohio where he has committed multiple offenses and served remarkably short sentences, as we all noted with a groan. It would be very interesting to find out how he went about those other sexual assaults. The bondage piece of equipment, could that be used for restraining purposes as well? And that might prevent her escape if she was bound together in some way?
Yes, and both women were bound when they were found. We know that this individual brought at least one and potentially 2 rolls of duct tape with them. We can even determine, based on the way that the duct tape was cut, the duct tape was not cut in the same order that it was put on the women. And so one of the FBI forensic investigators had supposed that the individual, and this is again the chilling organized fashion of this particular crime, that this individual had taken the time to cut and then hang these strips of duct tape and then use them. There's some evidence that tape was used first on one woman and then another, and then they were also bound using their own long underwear. So all of that, a bondage for all sorts of different reasons. So we have all of that. We know that the individual used that. We know that the individual obviously had a knife with them. There seems to be some evidence that the individual had potentially another type weapon with them based on the contusions and bruises that the women had on their faces, necks, and ears. They had been struck with something that had a very specific shape to it. These are all MOs. We know in at least one case, Jackson kidnapped and raped a woman at knife point. As I said on the last episode, to me, that's a proof of concept here. If he was kidnapping and raping women at knife point, I think that builds the connection of him to this case. But yes, we need to know more about him and his MO I think, to really understand the degree to which this is and is not aligned with his other crimes.
There's something very workmanlike about preparing the strips of tape, and that is what he does for a living. He is a painter. There's something about, I remember this from the book and earlier research, the strips of tape and lining them up for use. It always struck me as very workmanlike, and that is precisely what he does for a living.
Yes, and I will say, and this is very chilling for me, some of the questions I've always had, we should say that the FBI and the National Park Service really mishandled this evidence, right? There was a huge debate about whether or not it was going to get processed at the crime scene, whether it was going to get shipped to Quantico. In the end, what they decided to do was load it up into wheelbarrows, take it up to a ranger's cabin that wasn't being used, where they, and this just breaks my heart, hung it up to dry. So untold amounts of evidence fell out of the sleeping bags and the tents and everything else like that. And then they decided to process it at that ranger cabin. There may have been a lot more forensic and DNA evidence than we know about. That said, there was still not a lot. And one of the more chilling thoughts that I had was, as a painter, are you very equipped with the use of drop cloths that then perhaps you took? Another question that I've always had, and again, without being too graphic, this was such a violent way to kill these two women. It would have been next to impossible for you not to have been wearing their blood on you. This person somehow managed to get out we have always assumed this happened during daylight hours because of how tidy everything was. And this person managed to leave this crime scene undoubtedly somehow tainted with with the women's blood, with the murder weapon, and move unseen. People have always speculated that perhaps he had a change of clothes with him. Did he, for instance, have like a painter's
coveralls? Yeah.
Would he have known how to do that because of his job? Again, that gives me the chills to say out loud, but I think it's possible, certainly knowing what we know about him already.
And if we know anything about sexual assault in America, how much you want to bet that he was involved in a lot more sexual assaults than he was charged in? What I'm getting at is this guy is an experienced multiple offender. He knows what he's doing. That experience for him as a multiple offender could help prepare him for an even more extreme act of violence, which is killing Julie and Lollie at the Shenandoah National Park. All of that previous experience for the charged and, how much you want to bet, uncharged sexual assaults that he was involved in the years prior to that. He's well prepared on some level, and he knows what he's doing.
And he's bold, and he's audacious, and he's controlled. This was a very calculated, intellectual, cold-blooded crime in a lot of ways. The terms that criminologists use is organized versus disorganized. A crime of passion, a crime that begins as a rape and turns into a murder are usually disorganized crimes. They lack that level of sophistication. I think everybody agrees that this was a very organized, very sophisticated crime. And that requires real planning and intentionality and the ability to keep it together when two very strong women, who I'm sure did everything they could to fight for their lives and the lives of their beloved, this was a surmountable challenge for someone.
Yeah, this reminded me of one of the cases that you talked about in your book, Cary Stayner. This reminded me actually a lot of Cary Stayner and his series of crimes, which we could do a whole entire other podcast on. I did want to ask about one other thing that the FBI made a point of placing in their seeking information poster about Leo Jackson. They had mentioned first that he had two cars he was using, this chestnut brown AMC Eagle 30 and a Econoline van, which I've been flippantly calling the serial killer van, but it is what it is. But they also made a point of saying that he was known to use temporary tags, alter license plates, and frequently change vehicles. I'm curious if you think they're going to try to position him as a possible suspect in the Route 29 stalkings because they mentioned that information.
They tried awfully hard to position Daryl Rice in that way, despite the fact that Rice had alibis, I think, for almost all of them, if not all of them. One of the things, again, as I said on the last episode, as a journalist, I'm always simultaneously listening to what is said and what is not said. And often it's what's not said that's more interesting to me. During the press conference, they made a point of saying when they knew Daryl Rice was in the park. They did not say.
No, I noticed the same thing.
They did not say if and when Jackson was in the park. We have their Excel spreadsheet of all of the license plates of folks who were in the park that week. Now, we should say that one camera at one entrance station was broken. And so it is not a complete list. That said, I found it very notable that at no time did they say, we know that Jackson was in the park, for instance, on May 28th.
I noticed the exact same thing. That was
in fact, they seem to be
missing.
saying, don't worry about the fact that you're not going to find his license plate on this spreadsheet because he probably changed his license plate. And sure, he probably did. How much evidence do we have here? Would there have been a conviction in this case? We don't know.
Lots of questions remain.
Dear FBI, please answer these questions.
We agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment.
Dear FBI, please answer these questions and show your work. Please help us trust you. Please help us believe in you. Please, please.
We have said over and over, transparency and accountability are what we want from the FBI. So as Kate said, dear FBI, please show it. Show your work. I love that. Show your work. The book is Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. Kate, are you going to be writing a concluding chapter or an epilogue or something for this? I feel like you would almost have to.
I think we still have to see how this is going to play out. This is so new, and I think it's changing in real time. I am very fortunate that the book was optioned as a streaming series. And so I've been putting a lot of my attention into that. And I think that's probably where a lot of this work is going to appear. This is still very active to me. I'm still very much investigating that. So stay tuned, hopefully, for some more definitive news on the potential show. And we'll keep unpacking things there for sure.
Amazing. Thank you for joining us, Kate. We appreciate it. And thank you for all the work that you do on behalf of Julie and Lollie and their families and all the other victims in these cases. Your work is not unnoticed. It is very thoroughly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks to both of you. Thank you to your listeners. You two are out there doing God's work each and every single day. And so are your listeners. And being a part of this community is, I think, really important. And I've said this before, and it's a cliche, but I'm going to say it again. It takes a village to do this work. And I am so grateful for the number of sort of citizen sleuths out there who want to take this on with all of us. So please keep at it, folks. We need you all so much.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.